Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. I'm gonna start by briefly introducing Shannon Davis, who is gonna be introducing our authors and our panelists. Shannon is the Senior Acquisition Editor at Harvard Education Press. You can take it from here, Shannon.
Okay, thank you, Mayan. So thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the Gutman Library Book Talk for Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, Why Schools Can't Solve It Alone. As Mayan said, I'm Shannon Davis. I'm Senior Acquisitions Editor at HEP. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Sarah Winchell Lenhoff and Dr. Jeremy Singer, co-authors of Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism, which published by Harvard Education Press just last week. Dr. Sarah Lenhoff is the Leonard Kaplan Endowed Professor and Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at Wayne State University. She is the Director of the Detroit Partnership for Education Equity and Research, Detroit Peer. She began her career as a middle school teacher in New York City Public Schools and was previously the Director of Research and Policy at the Education Trust Midwest. Her research focuses on how education and other social policies shape access to educational opportunity. Dr. Jeremy Singer is a research assistant professor in educational leadership and policy studies at Wayne State University and the associate director of the Detroit Partnership for Education Equity and Research, Detroit Peer. He formerly taught in the Detroit Public Schools. His research focuses broadly on the intersections of educational policy and racial and socioeconomic inequality. Sarah and Jeremy are co-editors of the book Thinking Ecologically in Educational Policy and Research with Michael Gottfried, published by Routledge in 2024. Sarah and Jeremy, thank you for being here today. It is also an honor to introduce our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome Dr. Ethan Hutt. Ethan is Associate Professor and Gary Stuck Faculty Scholar in Education at the School of Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on the relationship between schools, the law, and education policy. Ethan is co-editor of the book Absent from School, Understanding and Addressing Student Absenteeism with Michael Gottfried, published by Harvard Education Press in 2019. Welcome, Ethan. Thank you for being here today. And thank you, Gutman Library, for hosting this book talk. So we will listen to your conversation and then reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A from our viewers. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Ethan, Sarah, and Jeremy.
Great, and thanks everyone for joining us. We just put in the chat that the chat is going to be disabled, but we invite you to put your questions into the Q&A feature, and I'll probably call on you to ask your question, or I'll just read it for you if you unmiked. I also just want to thank Gutman Library for convening us, and for Harvard Education Press for producing a really, really important text and in a really timely way. I think Harvard Education Press, for those of you who don't know, does a really good job at giving us books that I think have broad interest and broad applicability and can be really focal points for really important conversations between scholars and practitioners and communities. And I think this book exemplifies that maybe more than I won't say than any other book, but then a lot of books that I read and come across my desk. So I'm really excited that everyone's joined us today. And with that, I'll kick it to Sarah and Jeremy for some opening remarks, and then we'll get into some questions.
Thanks, everyone. So great to be here. Thank you for coming. We just have a few kind of opening slides to show you and some comments about why we wrote this book and the key takeaways. And then we're going to get into some discussion. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. And just make sure. Can you see that advance? Yeah, okay. Awesome. Well, so we wanted to just start off by telling you why we felt like we wanted to write this book. This book comes after about 8 years studying chronic absenteeism in Detroit. And we wanted to write this book because we felt like chronic absence was just on the radar of ed policy researchers, of education practitioners in schools and districts, and even at state levels, thinking about what can schools do about chronic absence. But in our research, we really found that although chronic absence is a problem that shows up in schools and it's a problem for schools, it's really not only or even mostly an educational issue or problem, and really requires kind of more from outside of school organizations, people, policies to solve it. So our study is really many different studies pulled together across the Detroit kind of educational ecosystem. And it doesn't tell, you know, a silver bullet story. You're not going to find at the end like, aha, this is how you solve chronic absence in any school in the country. But it really highlights how one large public school district, the Detroit Public Schools Community District, and their community partners in community-based organizations throughout Detroit really grappled with this issue over a decade and now going on 2 decades. And, you know, tried a lot of different things. Many of those things are things that schools across the country are now trying for the first time. And so we think there are important insights from our research that kind of point to what schools should be doing, what schools maybe shouldn't be doing, and also about kind of the limits of schools as the kind of key solution or site of solutions for this problem. Okay, so as I mentioned, we've been studying this issue for a long time. Our research is mixed methods. So we use, you know, kind of quantitative data analysis of administrative data, both from the Detroit Public Schools Community District, surrounding charter schools in Detroit, as well as the state of Michigan, as well as a lot of qualitative research, including observations of school-based practice, interviews with school practitioners working on the issue, and interviews with families, including high school students and parents, as well as some survey data, both with families and with school practitioners. And this work was really a partnership with this coalition that we worked closely with in Detroit, as well as the district, where we were kind of trying to use the research to help them figure out what was working, figure out how to get better. And, you know, it was sometimes messy and sometimes difficult trying things and seeing what worked. So we try to kind of document all of that, you know, trial and error, and everything that we learned and that our partners learned throughout the years. You know, Detroit we see as really kind of ahead of the curve. Chronic absence is in the news right now because post-pandemic, it's elevated across the country in all kinds of different contexts that maybe weren't facing this issue previously. So we think there's a lot to learn about the Detroit experience that we think can be helpful for other practitioners in public. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who's going to talk about some of the key takeaways of our work.
Thanks. Yeah. So just on this and the next slide, I want to try and highlight a few of the main points of what we cover in the book, documenting our research. We'll get into this all in greater detail in conversation. This slide, just to give everyone some context. So Detroit has always had a very high rate of chronic absenteeism dating back at least a decade, maybe more. Here you can see starting in the 2017-18 school year for the Detroit Public School District, over 70% of students were chronically absent that year, or maybe it was exactly 70%. And compare that to in the state of Michigan, on average, it was about 20% of students. And you can see that over time, those rates of chronic absenteeism remain high. The district follows a somewhat similar pattern to the rest of the state. So you can see in 2021, 22, there's that bump up because of COVID, and it remains a little bit higher. But I guess what we want to highlight is, first of all, you can see that Detroit did make some initial progress between 17-18 and 18-19, which is when they first started to implement some of these efforts. But those stalled out to an extent. They were kind of on track to stay around the same place in 2019-20 before the closure of schools during the onset of the COVID pandemic. And then we also highlight that they've actually made a bit of progress kind of getting back to where they were before the pandemic, a little bit better than other states, other schools in the state, which we think speaks to some of the strength of the systems and investments that they put in place. But at the end of the day, the rates of chronic absenteeism in the city remain extremely high. And so this is a story both of what some of the successes were in the things that they tried to implement, and also some of the challenges with implementing those, and why, when you especially take into consideration the out-of-school factors that drive absenteeism in the city, we need more than just a school-based approach to really make a significant dent in this issue. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, Sarah. So 3 points that, again, you'd read throughout the book, and just to quickly give you the snapshot of them. So the first bullet point is that chronic absenteeism is an ecological issue. So in chapter 1 of the book, we go into great detail on our research with families and using administrative and survey data to document all the causes of chronic absenteeism. And we really document, when we say ecological, what we mean is it's not just because of an individual, it's because of factors going on in their household and for their family, in their neighborhoods, in their schools for sure, but also the broader environment, things that affect all families in a city like Detroit. And so we kind of take that very contextual and holistic perspective to understand why so many students in a place like Detroit miss school. And we think that's a relevant way to look at the issue for any family or any context throughout the state, throughout the country, excuse me. And then, oh, sorry, we lost the slides there, Sarah. Thanks. There we go. Okay, so the second point was something that we document over the course of a few chapters in the book, that school-based solutions, which are really what we focused on researching in the book, they include specific types of tools or strategies and personnel employed in schools or districts that would be familiar to a lot of folks working in education, things that have parallels in academic work or in behavior management or supporting students' emotional and social well-being. These are tools that can make a difference, but are fundamentally not well aligned to the nature of the problem of chronic absenteeism on the whole, especially in high absenteeism contexts. And we also note some problems that arise when schools rely on these kinds of school-based solutions alone without intervention from outside of the school. There are issues with kinds of conflicts that people who are working on the problem face, conflicting expectations or demands on their time. We also document challenges related to inadequate resources. So when you find out what would help a student, do you actually have access to those things that would be helpful? And then pressure to focus on bubble kids. That's going to be familiar to any folks who are familiar with this phenomenon around instruction and testing, that students who are just chronically absent or just below, sort of regular attendance or positive attendance tend to be focused on more frequently than students who have greater depth of chronic absenteeism. We also document that sometimes negative perceptions of students and their families can emerge when schools are working along, trying their hardest to resolve these issues with just the tools and resources available to them, which can ultimately be counterproductive for the kind of solution that we're looking for. So we'll get into all these in detail, but these are some of the key points that we cover throughout the chapters of the book.
Okay, so at the end, we don't necessarily have a silver bullet solution, but we do offer some recommendations for educators, yes, for folks working in schools and districts, but also for policymakers and community members who are interested in doing something about this issue. So first and foremost, we have to emphasize, right, the ways in which poverty really just seeps into every kind of reason why kids might be missing school at extremely high levels, and plus, especially in places like Detroit, but also places in rural America, in other cities across the country. Reducing poverty, finding ways that policymakers can reduce poverty, we think is essential to reducing the kind of conditions that keep kids from school. Increasing access to existing resources. We found that often, organizations would kind of say that they offer these sorts of, basic needs resources to families or social services, but families have a hard time accessing them, right? So making sure that they can actually get the resources that are available to support their kind of family well-being. And really importantly, finding ways to facilitate cross-sector coordination. So although we don't think that schools should necessarily be the only or even at the center of solving this issue, they certainly need to be somewhere in the mix, and a really important role for policy to to do is to create the infrastructure that allows schools to better coordinate with the sorts of agencies and organizations that could fill in the gaps that schools can't fill. So, for instance, coordinating with the shelter system in cities to make sure that we're able to track students who are experiencing homelessness, who might need extra resources to make sure that they get to school. Facilitating coordination between school systems and transportation offices, where if you're relying on public transportation to help get kids to school, making sure that there's actually adequate kind of support for school going on public buses and other forms of transportation. The social sector needs of families, finding ways to make sure that schools know when families are receiving social services, when there are gaps in those social services, so that, again, they can coordinate with other organizations to fill in those gaps. As far as schools, we learned a lot about kind of the challenges of implementing attendance practice in schools and some of the things that didn't work. But we also learned that kind of focusing on the fundamentals of a positive school culture, positive communication with families can make a difference, and avoiding those counterproductive practices, which we see as punishment for attendance, overuse of suspension, and also kind of an over-reliance on truancy court or the threat of truancy court, which we have found can really kind of disrupt the trust that families need to have in schools in order to tell them what's going on, tell them why their child isn't showing up in school every day, and give the school an opportunity to help resolve that issue. And then, providing supports where they can, right? We don't think they can fill in all of these gaps, but, where they can provide food support with housing support with transportation, figuring out how they can do that efficiently. And then finally, community-based organizations can coordinate with districts and schools to provide resources that help meet family needs. And we actually think there's a lot of work already going on in CBOs that might be helpful for attendance, but we don't know it, right? There's not a lot of researchers sort of partnering with community-based organizations to better understand how their programming might already be a benefit to student attendance, either after school programming or other basic needs. So, supporting that kind of partnership between CBOs and school districts and researchers so we can better understand those relationships is a really important next step too. Okay, so we're done with our talk part, and we're excited to get into a discussion here with Ethan.
Fantastic. So I'll say again, for those who have just joined us, we're using the Q&A feature. So please put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll get to see them, and then we'll get to incorporate those. We really want this to be interactive, so please do put in the questions. The other thing, we'll re-put in the code for the book. You really should buy the book, and there's a 30% coupon. So we'll put that in the chat again for people who joined us late. But just going to that, because like when I see a new book out, I often am really curious how it's organized. Like, what can I expect to kind of walk through and learn? So can you just briefly, at a very high level, give us a sort of the table of contents of the book? Like, you mentioned that the first chapter really introduces and is really important in your ecological perspective. And then just kind of tell us, like, what else will we encounter in the chapters so we can get a sense of how this book is structured?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like we mentioned, after the introduction, we talk through the causes of chronic absenteeism. We try and give a really full look at that. And while our research is focused on Detroit, I think school and district leaders across the country would recognize the same kinds of issues that they're probably familiar with as they read that. And then we have a chapter that sort of describes the history of how a collection of community organizations and then eventually the school district in Detroit kind of came to elevate the issue of chronic absenteeism. And the reason that we have that chapter is it both helps explain who the kind of major stakeholders are, the major characters in our story, if you will, but also helps the reader, we hope, understand why people were so quick to adopt this very school-centric approach as opposed to one that involved a broader set of agencies and organizations outside of education alone. And then we get into the next chapter, which speaks to the sort of two major components of the school-based strategy that the district implemented, focusing on school-based personnel that had attended specific responsibilities and a multi-tiered system of approaching the issue in the school and in the district at large. And the next chapter, we kind of talk about how that initiative plays out. And we do have a chapter on how things unfolded during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So we sort of take two more chapters to trace the implementation of that initiative.
Great. I think that's really helpful to kind of getting people to, so you do cover COVID. So for people who are interested in what's changed since COVID, there's that. And then, okay, so I really want to pick up the sort of the core chapters I think of as like where you talk about the school-based solutions, and maybe you can answer it in two parts. So talk to us about what did Detroit do? Like, what did you see and how did that like really make it clear to you the limitations of this kind of school-centered approach? So for people who it maybe either resonates with something they're seeing in their own school district, or they're just trying to get a sense of maybe they're new to this topic. So like, let's take the multi-tiered system first, because I think that's like often what people think of as what makes it, that's what makes the school approach great. We have this multi-tiered system. There's many points of, like, so what did you see in Detroit? What were schools in Detroit doing in this kind of model? And then maybe you can kind of tease out for us, like, where you saw the real like cracks or limits of that approach that led you to some other conclusions about how we should approach this.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think one of the important things to note is that, like schools across the country, Detroit Public Schools Community District had a model of handling kind of very truant students for a long time, right? Which was send them to court, right? Send their families to court, right? They had an attendance agent who kind of would go to people's homes with a badge. They were deputized, and they would threaten them with court punishment, send them to court. That was their model for years and years and years. So in about 2015, 2016, they pivoted. They really left that legacy behind. They wanted to have a positive culture around attendance. They wanted to shift to a holistic approach. And so, we see that as a real positive of the Detroit story, where, they recognized all of the kind of ecological reasons why kids were missing school. They wanted to address those. They realized that kind of the truancy model didn't make sense for chronic absence, especially since 70% of students were chronically absent, right? So they pivoted, and they did two things. They took that attendance agent role and really recreated it. They kept the name, and that's about it. They asked that person to basically create an attendance plan for each school. They were each school had at least one attendance agent. And that person was responsible for organizing an attendance team at their school. And then that team, and especially the agent, implemented a multi-tiered system of support that was adapted for chronic absenteeism. So if many of you are familiar with kind of a tiered system that helps you organize students based on their kind of learning levels or discipline, this would organize students based on how much they were absent. So tier 1 would be students who are not chronically absent, right? They're below that 10% threshold. Tier 2 is between 10 and 20%. Tier 3 was above 20%. So right off the bat, we saw some problems with this kind of approach. The big one being that in a place like Detroit, about a third of students were actually in tier 3, right? They're missing more than 20% of school days regularly. And that means that, a high intensity approach to resolving those issues, which is what a typical MTSS would call for, right? Like higher cost, more intensive intervention, just is basically impossible to implement when you're trying to reach 30% of your students with that high intensity, high cost effort. So there was a misalignment, I think, between just what the schools could do because of the numbers and that system. And then I think another, thing that we observed is that those tiers are not actually very useful in helping to inform an attendance agent about what's going on behind the scenes. Like, why are students missing school? Students could have a transportation issue and be at, just over the 10% threshold, or they could be, way off in tier 3. They may need a really similar approach to helping them get to school. But because they're organized in these different tiers, the model sort of implies a certain kind of approach. So I'll give you an example. For a long time, the district and their community partners really supported this, assigning students in tier 2 to a mentor in the school, right? An adult in the building who could, connect with the student, get to know them, and, with the idea that that would kind of encourage them to come to school. Now, we're not saying that's a bad idea in general, right? Like, there's a lot of evidence that kind of relationship building and mentorship is important and can work. But, to sort of take that blanket approach for every student in tier 2 means that you're missing a lot of students who, they want to be in school, maybe they already have connections, but they, have a chronic health issue that's not resolved because they don't have health care. And that's the problem they need solved, right? It's actually not the relationship. And so just this kind of persistent misalignment in the approaches and the reasons why kids were missing, and also the kind of magnitude of the issue. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to add to that.
Jeremy, can I get you to, so that was great. Jeremy, do you want to touch, like, so you also mentioned about personnel. So can you get us a sense of, how was, so the renaming stuff, like how were, I think a lot of districts have like sometimes pretty elaborate structures of people whose jobs are nominally related to or supposed to be on absentee. Can you give us a sense about like where Detroit started and in terms of how it was organizing its personnel? What was it actually doing? And then maybe some of the evolution you saw, or maybe some of the ways that you think that to the extent that we have people designated to think about chronic absenteeism or attendance, like how they might best be used in a school system.
Yeah, absolutely. So to recap a little of what Sarah said, the district already had some people in place that were kind of at the district level. They're going school to school, maybe they're assigned regionally in the city, and they're mostly focusing on students who are formally, legally classified as truant, and they're doing some interventions, possibly pushing them into the sort of court truancy referral pipeline. But that is revised as part of this strategy that we document in the book, where these personnel are pushed into the school instead of at the district. Additional personnel are hired, and now these attendance agents are kind of school-focused people. And what we document in the book is that what really ends up happening is, because there's a few different ways that this role could play out, the attendance agents end up embodying 3 different versions of the role all at once. So the first one is a bit of a continuation of what they were already doing in truancy work, which is kind of this bureaucratic approach. And we don't mean bureaucratic in a derogatory way, just in a descriptive way, that it's about following the kind of rules and methods that are outlined by the district. So you're supposed to call home at a certain number of days absent. You're supposed to file certain paperwork. You're supposed to conduct home visits at a certain number of days absent. You're supposed to refer students to certain legal interventions if it gets to that point. So there was a big emphasis on kind of following a routine. Then there was, because they were in the school and because there was kind of an emphasis of trying to break with some of that tradition of truancy enforcement, and especially informed by broader ideas in the country about kind of a school improvement approach to attendance, there was this more autonomous, professionalized role where in the school, these folks were developing things like the mentorship program, school-based incentives or rewards for coming to school, that they were trying to develop school-based strategies that might be useful. And then the third role is kind of this more intensive caseworker role, a kind of thing that's been around for a long time, and that even under the sort of older model of truancy, you would have these kind of personnel doing this sort of stuff. So they would have, student by student or family by family relationships where they're trying to understand what's the root cause for absenteeism and how can we help resolve that. So the one big problem that we document is because they're trying to do all 3 of those types of things at once, that's a very overwhelming job. So they're trying to just do the routine expected phone calls and home visits, and that's taking up, that kind of compliance oriented work is taking up a huge chunk of their time. It's also taking a lot of time to launch new school-based initiatives from scratch, which oftentimes don't have much of an impact anyway, but which are being really encouraged as part of their professional roles. And then the casework is potentially very impactful, but it's very time intensive, and there's only so many students that they're able to really work with. So the position itself was a really interesting idea. We know that there's schools and districts across the country who are considering this. It's probably a little less common than the multi-tiered system, which you probably find in just about every context. But well, I guess what we hope other folks take away from this point is that it's really important to carefully define that role and really think about how best can these personnel suit the nature of the problem. So we talk in our recommendations chapter about potentially positioning these personnel as navigators. So not necessarily people who can work with every single individual family as in casework, but they may be best used to help families access the kinds of resources that help resolve their issues, as opposed to implementing other strategies that might not have as much of a bang for your buck.
Fantastic. So I'm gonna re-encourage people to put in their questions. I have lots, but I prefer to hear them from you. I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to hear it from you guys. What's wrong with, so, okay, I hear everything you're saying, lots of work to be done, but what's wrong with holding schools accountable? I should say, for those of you who don't know, many states under ESSA decided that when they got the opportunity to do a fifth indicator, a lot of them picked chronic absenteeism as a chronic indicator. We've seen absences get used more in accountability context or administrative monitoring context. What's wrong with having a chronic absentee measure used as a way of evaluating school performance at multiple levels? Like, is it redeemable, or is this irredeemably problematic, and we should, really call our state folks and be like, we need a different indicator?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we think chronic absence can be a useful a useful measure to indicate a major issue with attendance at a school, and that somebody needs to be working on, right? But I think we would argue that it doesn't make a lot of sense to put it into a school accountability system. The first reason is because of this larger point that schools are not well positioned to solve the root causes that are keeping kids from school. So you're essentially holding them accountable for something that's not within their direct influence, or at least the full, the majority of reasons kids are missing are not within their influence. And so it's just a misalignment between what schools can do and what you're holding them accountable for. I think the second thing is that we observed a kind of corrosive effect of chronic absence being in the accountability system, and just, so folks understand, right? It's not just in state school accountability. That trickles down to what school practitioners are experiencing, right? So chronic absence then made it into the district-wide datacom meetings, right? The principals were kind of held to account for their chronic absence numbers. And therefore they held their school staff to account for those numbers. And that means that, we observe school staff working really hard at the margins, right? Like at kids right above that 10% threshold, right? Thinking that, we need to get them below 10% because that'll improve our numbers and, and get kids to school more often. I don't want to suggest that's a bad thing to help them get to school. But it's also just a little bit of an arbitrary number, right? Like kids who are at 9% are also probably missing too much school, and just as kids at 20%, right? So, improving attendance overall, improving the attendance rate for any kid is a good thing, whether or not they're sort of below that 10% threshold. And then, we document in the book that especially when you have individuals in schools who are sort of personally accountable in their jobs for improving this number, and it's really hard to do because of that, the limit of their scope of influence, they end up over time really adopting kind of a deficit perspective of families, because they're kind of hitting their head up against a wall, right? They're saying, folks are saying you're responsible for this and you can do it, and you're not seeing success. And so they look to someone to blame, right? And we found some evidence that school staff will look to parents. They'll say parents don't care, or, parents are checked out. They don't care about education. They don't want their kids here. And one, we found basically no evidence or very limited evidence of that on the parent side, right? Parents really want their kids in school. They're trying really hard. And two, that sort of deficit perspective limits the ability of school staff to really build those trusting relationships that we think are like fundamental to kind of improving the school culture to the extent that folks can, and therefore improving attendance.
Yeah. Ethan, I hope you don't mind. I'll just chime in real quick.
Please, please, please.
And since Ethan is a historian, and so I want to offer maybe a historical way to look at this too. Like, so when truancy laws were first put into place, there was an emphasis on just getting kids to participate in school, period. And so I want to give credit to folks who really pushed for chronic absenteeism conceptually and as a measure that we should use, whether to inform our thinking or as part of an accountability system, to help us move past that historical way of looking at truancy to a sort of more updated way of looking at it. That the emphasis is not just about our kids participating in school, but how much school are they missing, because when they miss school, that has negative consequences for their outcomes. That leads to lower graduation rates. It leads to lower test scores, which mean less, like we are representative of less learning. That can have consequences for your educational success, whether it's higher education or your lifetime earnings and in jobs and so on. So kind of shifting us from just thinking about attendance as a requirement of the state to attendance as something that positively contributes to your life outcomes. And so we should care about that. And excuse me, I guess what we're trying to suggest is that there was a downside to that push as well, which is that it narrowed the field of thinking about absenteeism to the school as a site for solutions. So since the problem is one where if you're missing school, that's a problem, we're also saying schools should be the solution because it's now this accountability element for schools. So I think we're trying to push for maybe a further evolution of this thinking, which is that it's really important to be paying attention to this idea, to be thinking about the positive case for improving attendance, and to move past the kind of old punitive, maybe truancy way of doing things, but also to widen the scope as opposed to narrow it, to not just think about schools and hold schools accountable, but think about transportation, healthcare, housing, social services, this broad set of parts of the landscape to play a role.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have two short questions for you, and then I'm going to kick it to the audience. So the first question is, I think something that a lot of us are hearing or are seeing speculated about. Did COVID change everything we know about absences and chronic absenteeism? Like, how much is this a post-COVID story? Do we have to relearn everything? Can you just reflect on what you saw in terms of COVID and how that might affect people's view of this challenge or this issue?
I'll go first, and then Sarah, please chime in. I think the answer is no, it doesn't require us to relearn things. I mean, there are additional lessons from the pandemic for sure. So what don't we know? There's still a little bit of a mystery on exactly why absenteeism rates are higher and remain higher. And I think the answer is that it's a lot of things, which is why we don't have a single simple answer. But schools are trying very hard now to improve attendance. And so one thing that we learned from our work in Detroit is that in the face of an increased problem, the same tools are available to schools. So that's what we document in our chapter on COVID, is that the problem got worse and it got more complicated in some ways, but the toolbox and the personnel and the resources remain the same. So, and our work as it expands outside of Detroit into Michigan and other parts of the country, we're seeing, a similar story, which is that the toolbox and the resources remain the same for schools. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, is both that the nature and why students miss school, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. It's certainly a bigger issue now than it was several years ago, but fundamentally the reason why some places have very high absenteeism rates and others have lower absenteeism rates, those things are the same. And also the toolboxes available to schools, and therefore the need to expand the intervention beyond just the school, that remains the same as well.
Anything you want to add, Sarah?
Yeah, I'll just say, we document this in the book. Yes, the toolbox remain the same, but I do think, at least in Detroit, and they had many years now under their belt of experience trying to deal with this issue, we did see a pivot in the district post-COVID to thinking more about how to coordinate across agencies and organizations outside of schools. So for instance, there's a major effort in Detroit to install school-based health centers, right, which have some evidence of, bringing this kind of outside of school problem and the solution into schools, kind of modeled after the community schools approach, for instance. So we see that as a good thing, as a positive step, and as maybe a learning through COVID about the sort of in-your-face ways that the stuff outside of school can really affect what's going to go on inside.
Okay, so my other question is, so let's say so Detroit got this great, huge, you've given them a real gift by studying them for, you said 8 years. If I'm working in a district or a parent in a district or working in a district, how would you recommend that we go about, so you talk a lot about misalignment, you talk a lot about thinking about roles, and you think about, okay, an ecological approach requires thinking about other agencies or other organizations that are part of the communal fabric and touch students' lives and families' lives. Do you have any advice about how you would recommend for people in other districts to go begin this work that you have done in Detroit of really trying to understand chronic absence in that context, and what would it take, what is involved in kind of beginning to turn from a school-based perspective to an ecological perspective? And then I'm going to once again encourage, that's my last question, I'm going to ask the audience to start participating. And I was told, sorry, I can't unmute you to ask your question. So if you put them in the question and answer box, I will ask them for you, but I will give you a citation credit for asking a good question.
Asking your excellent questions. Yeah, send us your questions. Okay, so what can you do? Well, first of all, there's been a lot of great research on attendance and chronic absence. A lot of it has focused on the effect of chronic absence on student outcomes. And the sort of literature on what actually works is pretty thin. So I would say, first and foremost, don't be afraid to try stuff, right? If you're a district or you're a local community organization who works with an individual school that's struggling with chronic absence and you have an idea, it's worth trying it. I mean, you're not going to find a ton of research out there that says do this one thing and it will work, or don't do this other thing. So I think this is an area for a lot of potential innovation. I mentioned earlier that CBOs across the country are working with schools on all kinds of different things, right? On after school programming, on whether it's transportation, whether it's basic needs things. Maybe these things are actually improving attendance for the small number of students and families that you're able to reach. Partner with a local university professor to try to study if those things work at a small scale to inform potential policy investment, right? We need to know what works in order to know what to scale up. And I would say, I've also been thinking about how organizations like PTOs could play a role in creating some of the kind of social connection that we think is important. We didn't talk about that much yet, but we really found in Detroit, one of the big challenges in getting to school is that we've sort of lost this community-centered schooling model in which neighbors are all going to school together. And so if you have an issue, if your car breaks down or you need to get to work early and can't get your child to school, you might have a neighbor who can help out, right? We've really lost that in places like Detroit and across the country. And so finding ways at the very local micro level to kind of re-knit that social fabric, we think could have a lot of, has some potential to support attendance in a very local way. So, maybe encouraging phone trees to help fill in the gaps for transportation or something like that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add before we move to other questions is I would definitely encourage district and school leaders to start by listening. I mean, that's how we started in our research is we started by hearing from families about why it is that their children would miss school. And it's such a complicated issue. And so what you're ultimately going to hear is lots of different reasons. They change from family to family. They change for the same family from year to year. But I think that's a really important place to start as well, is take some time to really understand what the main reasons are that the students who are chronically absent in your school, what's really going on there, instead of presuming what's going on. Make sure you really understand that to guide your action.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have a question from Marnie, I hope I said that right, who was curious about, and it kind of dovetails nicely with your last answer of what was the most surprising intervention? Like, what was something that really surprised you? Because you talk about how, like, this is not like you can just pull the solutions out of a bag. So surprising things that actually worked to or had traction with the community to address chronic absence and help students and families get to school, get their kids to school. What was most surprising?
To be honest with you, we really focused on the district-wide initiatives with the attendance agent and MTSS, and we certainly saw examples of individual relationship building between school staff, like attendance agents and families, work at the individual level, right? So I think in particular, those started with listening, right? And then started with some sort of documentation of what the actual issues were, what are the key barriers, and then figuring out the resources, whether that was pulling from one example actually is transportation is a major problem in Detroit. It's very hard for the school district to kind of get every kid to school on a school bus. They don't have universal transportation, but the district can be flexible, right? So if they identify a student who is in dire need of a ride and they can figure out a way to get that kid to a school bus stop, even if they're not technically eligible, then they did that, right? So we have examples of attendance agents sort of working within the existing system to connect a child to an existing resource when otherwise kind of on paper they wouldn't be eligible by policy. So some of those kind of creative ways we did find worked, but again, I mean, just to be frank, like that was at a pretty small scale, right? It was difficult for attendance agents to sort of scale those things up to meet the demand.
Yeah, another example that's similar to that is just getting students who would be eligible for them homelessness services. So under federal law, districts are obligated to provide transportation and continuity of enrollment if you're experiencing homelessness. And that includes if you're living doubled up, right? So if you don't have a home of your own and you're living with a family or friend. And Detroit is one place, but there's many where homeless students are under-identified. So, basic rule of thumb, you would expect there to be a lot more students who are identified as homeless in Detroit, and this is true in a lot of cities and areas of the country, than are actually identified. So, at the same time that we were doing our research, the district really had ramped up and improved its identification of students experiencing homelessness. But again, like Sarah said, these are sort of case-by-case instances. But this is definitely a good example of stuff that would help, because once you guarantee those families a ride to school, that's taking care of a good chunk of the issues that they're facing there. And I'll just add one other thing from an organizational perspective. There's the data side. So data is like one thing that I hope people take away from our book is data is not a solution. It's obviously an enabling condition, but data analysis alone, or like tracking the issue in data, is not going to solve the problem. But we did see over time the district's investment in stronger data systems just saved people a lot of time. So if it's like an enabling condition to help action at the school or district level, making sure that the technology systems are in place, that's easy to see what who's missing school and what the patterns of attendance look like. That was at one point a very big burden, a lot of manual work compiling that data, and it became a lot easier and automated over time.
I like that framing as data as an enabling force as opposed to an end in itself. That's nice. Okay, so David wants to know, and I think this is sometimes this is really important to say, which is not just that something doesn't work, but trying to understand why doesn't it work. So why don't reward and incentive programs, which are so popular and kind of everywhere, why don't they work? Like, what is the issue with them so that we can understand and maybe again point towards things that might work better? So can you just articulate that for us?
You want me to start, Jeremy?
Yeah, go ahead. I can go if you want.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So incentives are very popular because they're very intuitive. People think that if you kind of encourage or motivate someone to do something, then they might do it. But there's a lot of there's problems with the concept in the first place. So first, as we document, the reason that students miss school is not often, maybe rarely, even a motivational problem. It's not necessarily the case that students will be able to get themselves to school if they're having a problem with a ride to school, just because there's an incentive waiting for them, or if they're getting sick too often, an incentive is not necessarily going to help them overcome that problem. And then it's also the case that the way that incentive programs themselves are designed and implemented can be really flawed. So for example, if you kind of retroactively announce a reward, which is often the case because schools have a lot going on and sometimes they just sort of put these things together, then it's obviously not going to have any impact because students don't even really realize they're going to get rewarded. There's also research that suggests that when students are rewarded, sometimes when that reward goes away, that slight increase in attendance goes away as well, or attendance for students that was already good can go down because they start to recognize, oh, I actually have really good attendance compared to my peers, so it's okay if I miss a day or two. So these kinds of things can kind of backfire. I mean, in Detroit, they actually experimented with a very substantial incentive, something much more significant than what we've seen in the past. This is not in the book because it's something that they did this school year. Where they gave $200 to students in high school for every 2 weeks of perfect attendance. So this means not even missing a single class period. The district is reporting that they saw some promising results. We'd like to see, what their internal analysis looks like. It definitely seems like it has helped with attendance a bit, but there's some questions that we have, obviously, like, did this just help students with slightly bad attendance improve, or did it actually help students at the lower end as well? And also questions about the cost effectiveness of it. But yeah, so there's some real flaws with the logic of incentives, and schools should just be careful relying too much on those.
That's great. Okay, so we have two other good. Sarah, did you want to jump in on that? Because we got two good questions I want to make sure we get to. So
Go ahead.
no, I don't want to cut you off.
Last quick thing just is that I think for us, it's also a question of cost benefit, right? We think there's likely to be not a great benefit of incentives, but it's costly, maybe not in terms of the actual money that you're spending, but logistically, right? Like figuring out these programs, spending instructional time with parties and things like that really there's very little evidence that they're going to have much payoff, and they're also not typically very sustainable.
Great. So Richard asked a really good question, which is we've talked about schools and districts. What role can states play here in addressing chronic absences and making sure that we, kind of facilitate the ecological approach that you suggest?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think they can, potentially remove chronic absence for school accountability. Take that accountability and shift it. And we think there should be this kind of mutual accountability between schools and districts and states and families, and sort of the service they're providing and the resources to show up. I think states can play a really important role in helping to facilitate data sharing across agencies. So a good example is in Michigan. We have a long history of having health and human service workers actually working in schools to help coordinate families who are receiving benefits, and finding ways to actually allow those kinds of folks to have access to student attendance records so that they know when families on their caseload are missing school, they can intervene, they can try to find out what's going on. It's another person who can help. So the data sharing piece, I think, is essential. I think funding for things that are essential for getting kids to school, I think we nationwide have a real problem in funding transportation, especially in context with lots of school choice. So I would say, if you're going to implement a statewide school choice policy, you got to have some sort of transportation funding to make that actually work, and make sure that kids can actually get to school.
Great. Okay, so the last question we have is a question from Amber, who actually appears to have bought the book already. So good job, Amber, and everyone else. You should follow suit. Points out that in the first chapter of the book, there's a figure that has structural and environmental challenges indexed, plotted against chronic absenteeism, and Amber was wondering whether you know or have done some research, or maybe you're encouraging some of our audience members who maybe are graduate students, if there's been any exploration of those outliers, that the policies or strategies they approach. And if you don't know directly, then maybe you can speak to kind of what hunches or what questions you might have about those outlier cities. Again, with an eye towards helping us understand, like in our own context, how would we begin to think about the rates of chronic absenteeism and things like environmental or structural challenges.
Yeah, I love that idea, and thank you for asking so specifically about that. So first of all, I would say we should probably do an update on that data, because when we first did that analysis, we were using 2015-16 data in 2018-19, so we were only a little bit late. So I think the first thing that would be worthwhile is to see, what cities or districts, where do they land on that chart today? That's the first thing I would say. And then I also want to note that we used, and that's why we were really struck by just how strong this correlation was, because we used a relatively blunt set of measures to kind of characterize these broad inequalities that a city or a district might face. Things like the level of historical segregation or population loss, the current levels of unemployment and poverty, crime and blight, even things like the temperature, to account for the fact that there are these like regional differences in weather, and community-wide asthma rates as a proxy for broader health issues. So that's the other thing, is I think it would be worthwhile to start by digging into other things that we weren't able to capture in that kind of index. So we don't have anything, for example, on the quality or strength of transportation, public transportation resources, or also the average sort of transportation vulnerability. So there's transportation vulnerability indices that can be used as measures, for example. We didn't have anything included in there on housing stability or housing affordability. So I would start with other of those kind of broader conditions that we weren't able to capture back in that original research. And then from there might dig into what's happening in terms of education policy. But yeah, I think the idea of kind of looking at some possible positive outliers sounds great. I would just say, I think a good starting point would be updating and enhancing further this kind of analysis that we started with that guided us.
Well, I want to give you, looking at the clock, and I want to be respectful of, first, thank everyone for coming today. And again, want to thank Gutman Library for organizing this, and Shannon for being part of the Harvard Ed Press team that produces such great and timely books on really important issues that touch our lives and the lives of our students and teachers and administrators. And then also to thank Jeremy and Sarah for doing the hard work. I mean, this is when you read the book, you will see how in-depth the research is and how fine-grained the analysis is, which is really, really what we need to solve a problem as complicated and contextual as chronic absenteeism. So I want to thank everybody. And Sarah, Jeremy, last word for our audience as we...
Just thank you so much for being here. And obviously there's a lot more that we can talk about. So if you have more questions or just want to talk more, we're really happy to do that. We want this to be helpful to folks who are trying to improve attendance in their local schools and cities. So thanks so much for this opportunity.
Please don't hesitate. Yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.